All right, I think we have critical mass. I'll just start with some of the intros and then we'll get into the core of the conversation. So once again, welcome everybody. Great to see you all. Thank you so much to our partners from Network for Good for hosting this session today. My name is Deniz. I'm one of the challenge managers from the Climate Resiliency Challenge, and I'm just going to do a little bit of recap of the challenge, highlight some of the criteria just as a starting point for the conversation that's going to follow. So let me share my screen and hope it works. Slideshow. All right, can you all see my screen? Okay, perfect. I'm not going to talk too much, just a little recap. So probably all of you in the discussion already know, but we just hosted our 8 weeks open submission, open innovation climate resiliency challenge, where we explored the question of how might we empower frontline communities to prevent, prepare for, and recover from the most urgent climate-related disasters. We were specifically focused on wildfires, floods, and extreme weather. Over 400 submissions were received across the globe. There was a huge amount of submissions, which was fantastic to see. Out of this bucket, we had to narrow down to finalists, which we had 34 ideas, emerging, mid-stage, and advanced solutions. So ranging from people who were just starting out to people who already have businesses around some of the work. And we finally narrowed down to our winners. There were 13 of them, 5 emerging, 5 mid-stage, and 3 advanced. All this is to say, first of all, thank you to everybody who participated, whether you won or not. It was a huge effort to see the range of submissions, to contribute to others' proposals, and to comment and help each other grow through the open innovation process. So thank you everybody that contributed and participated. And just to start us off here, today's topic is about storytelling for impact and how to sort of work towards wonderful submissions, pitch decks, ideas, where you're crafting your story in a compelling way. So to kick us off, I just want to mention some of the evaluation criteria for this challenge and what made some of the submissions great. What was the story that compelled us, that made people finalists and winners? We had 5 criteria: relevant, novel, impactful, equitable, and community informed. So when we were reading through submissions, we really looked at how relevant this is to our how might we statement. Do they tell the story of how they're contributing to responding to a particular disaster? So if a solution specifically said, we're focused on wildfires versus we are addressing climate disasters or we are addressing climate change, that meant more to us. Being specific, being able to give us the example of this is what we do, showing us a direct relevancy. So that was definitely number 1, where we looked at how does this directly connect to a disaster? How do they directly connect to a frontline community? And also, what does that mean for people? So being able to go from broad terms to specific examples in the submission was a big thing for us when we looked at relevancy. Second was novelty. This was solutions that change the structures, technologies, and standards of today's effects of climate-related disasters. So here, when we were looking for novelty, what mattered to us was people being able to articulate what the current situation is and then explicitly calling out, this is how we're novel, this is how we're unique, this is the new thing that we are doing. So looking at being able to distinctly identify what is new there versus telling us what you do, but us not being able to directly make that connection. Also, just not assuming that everybody knows the background of something. So just providing a little bit of background and then building on that with your specific idea was something that helped us think about novel. Third was impactful. Here we looked at how scalable solutions are when they may be initiated, what their timelines might be, and also what kind of evidence and trends that they're submitting to us. So here, impact was really important to show evidence through. So we looked at timelines. It was valuable if people said, this is our timeline or trajectory of things that we're going to do. It was important to show scalability, especially into North America. So we looked at evidence for this is what we do, and this is how it could transfer or scale. So people giving examples, case studies, showing us how they're sort of building their trajectory. So very concrete evidence, whether that's timelines, anecdotes, quotes, data, statistics, that was really helpful to build that narrative. Fourth and fifth was equitable and community informed. Here we looked at how people are considering communities and involving communities in their solution. So being able to call out specific partners, being able to talk about lived experience, and then listing your considerations for how you are valuing the communities that you work with in your story. That was big. So here, a lot of people shared lived experience. A lot of stories started with, this is my personal experience with XYZ disasters. That was very compelling. There were quotes and anecdotes from partners, nonprofits, communities on the ground that people worked with. Those were really compelling, as well as just sort of talking about different considerations people made. So considering affordability, accessibility, being able to engage people in communication, and giving us examples of when they've done those things or how they're considering those things. That was also big. So overall, what was very compelling in a story was it being personal, rooted in lived experience, or highlighting how they personally relate to the solution at hand, what kind of passion they have for it, even if they don't have lived experience. Being able to give examples, highlights, and direct anecdotes, quotes, or statistics, as well as being able to provide the background and then build on it with your new sort of trajectory. So just a recap of what were some things that we thought were very compelling. And I'm going to stop there. And I'm going to let our partners from Network for Good introduce themselves, their organization, and then take it from there. So thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Dennis. I'm Maddie Van here from Network for Good. I lead strategy. We are a donor-advised fund that moves contributions from individual donors to nonprofits, have moved about $5 billion over the last 20 years to over 450,000 nonprofits. And I'm very excited today to be joined by our CEO, Abby Ross, and our Director of Operations, Shruti Shah, who will be sharing with you some of their thoughts on best practices and tips for how to tell the story of your solution, your business, or your organization to continue attracting investors, collaborators, and others to your cause as you move your innovations forward. Before we hop into the conversation, Abby, I would love it if you could start with a quick introduction of yourself and your background.
Sure. Thanks, Maddie. Super excited to be here. So I started my career as an entrepreneur. I was part of a travel startup that grew really quickly. We raised about $3 million in seed capital, grew to about 10 million users, and then were acquired by Expedia. I then went on to run a web design and development company for about 3 years, pitching brands and agencies about how they can go through digital transformation. And then I was the co-founder and chief product officer of an education technology company. I started that with my co-founder, Eileen, who was a teacher for 20 years and the director of curriculum and instruction in Chicago Public Schools. So had a really, really great opportunity to be able to go deep into a field that I didn't know a lot about, education, and was kind of the entrepreneur business side. And got to, we raised about $25 million in capital and venture capital across 3 different rounds of funding. So have a lot of experience building pitch decks and pitching in different types of investors at various stages of companies. And through that experience, I also have been fortunate enough to mentor a lot of early stage entrepreneurs, whether that's in technology, hardware, community solutions. I'm based in Chicago and now have been the CEO of Network for Good for about 18 months. And in doing so have been thinking about how we evolve our strategy to think about how we can provide more durable funding and capital for sustainable outcomes. So this project and competition was really great experience for us to learn about ways in which we might think about new structures of capital to help budding entrepreneurs, and business folks bring great solutions to market that we know will get at a sustainable, community-driven outcome.
Thanks, Abby. And we are also joined today by Shruti, who is the Director of DAF Operations at Network for Good, but that is not the only hat she wears in her professional life. So Shruti, I'd love it if you could please take a moment to introduce yourself and your background as well.
Thanks so much, Maddie, for having us. My name is Shruti. I started my career actually in education. I was a public school teacher in Baltimore, and I got really interested in the role that technology could play in the classroom and changing outcomes for students, and ended up working for the New Schools Venture Seed Fund, which is an early stage venture capital fund, which is now called Reach Capital. Did that for a while and then caught the entrepreneurial bug myself, and ended up building a venture called MoveLoot. It was an online marketplace for used furniture that had a sustainability angle. Furniture waste is the second highest waste category behind food waste. And so we wanted to encourage the buying and selling of used items over new, and wanted to make that process easier for people. So that business went through Y Combinator. We raised, similarly to Abby, about $22.5 million over 3 rounds of funding. I was the co-founder and COO of that company. We scaled to 7 or 8 markets across the country with big warehouse operations. And basically, I think we're in a position where we had to change some of our strategy because of where the market was at the time, and it ended up not working the way that we'd hoped. So after that, I worked for a time as an entrepreneur in residence at Silicon Valley Bank, where I got to spend a lot of time coaching founders on everything from fundraising strategy to overall business strategy to operations. And then I was at Nike, where I helped design their first strategy for resale, helping a brand that has a really large footprint think about their sustainability efforts. And I'm also an investor. I'm an angel investor, and I just recently launched a fund called Symphonic Capital that looks at really founders from diverse backgrounds that are really thinking about the impact that they can have in the world, whether that's across fintech or healthcare or climate. So I get to have kind of the best of both worlds, both getting to be in operations at Network for Good, but also getting to be inspired and supportive of amazing entrepreneurs.
So I'm excited for a discussion that we will have today. There is an opportunity for Q&A at the end as well, and I might pull in some questions that emerge in the Q&A throughout the discussion too, if they're relevant to what we're talking about. So please feel encouraged to add any questions or thoughts you have in there, and we'll moderate as we move through. But obviously, Abby and Shruti bring some really wonderful experience across both sort of the founder, entrepreneur side of things, and also investing. So I think some good advice, hopefully, to be had today. Abby, I'm going to start with a question for you. Just a general question about what advice you like to give to entrepreneurs who are trying to tell their story, and how that advice might change depending on the particular audience.
Sure. So couple things. One is, one of the things you as an entrepreneur need to recognize is that you are the expert. You know way more than your audience probably does. So one of the kind of first things you need to do is make a really accessible pitch of understanding. Now that can happen in a couple of different ways. One is think about storytelling. So what is the personal connection? What is your lived experience? What is kind of the must moment? What is the root problem that you have seen, experienced, lived? Kind of take that, then think about how do you back that up with data? Why does this matter? Why does this matter at scale? What are the macro trends that are kind of leaning into? And then what is a quick, accessible understanding of your solution? So if you are a highly technical founder and you need to have a PhD to understand what you're doing, you got to dial it back and put it into kind of regular, everyday, accessible ways for kind of people to understand. If you can do that, so you can explain it to basically anybody off of the street, you will have a successful pitch, because that is kind of the basic foundation of how to think about creating and crafting a pitch so that people quickly can understand, why is this important? What is the kind of grand scale? And why are you or your business the ones with the right solution? So that's kind of number one thing to do. Number two thing to do is in putting together kind of that context, really think about ways in which you can, the how it works, the why it works is where sometimes things can get a little bit stuck in the mud. But that storytelling component of, kind of first, second, third, that's tying it back to kind of the problem you're trying to solve. Make it seem really easy. Even though you know it's not, you want the solution to sound easy. One of the best kind of pieces you can get, or pieces of feedback you can get from folks, is, why doesn't this exist already? What do you mean that's not how it happens? And then you get to really unpack all the complexities that you know about as an entrepreneur and educate your audience along with you. Well, this might be a policy issue. This might be a community issue. This might be something that, you know, is a macro trend or a really kind of nuanced conversation that you might need to educate your audience on, but you can't get there if you don't like have them in the mindset to understand that. So that's kind of, while it might seem like a little bit of a duh, is like starting with a basic universal audience from go, then recognizing you've got the skills, you've got the kind of brain to be able to go 3 or 4 levels deep, but you got to set the hook with the basic kind of universal pitch and understanding. Maddie, did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. I mean, it absolutely did. And,
Okay.
and Shruti's version of it too. I mean, you talked about sort of the accessible piece, tell the story from your own perspective, to make it clear why this is something you care about. And then also, I think part 2, make it seem easy, sounds like actually a very challenging piece of this, because often these are extremely complex problems. I think every application I read in this challenge was like, wow, this is an extremely nuanced and challenging operation, but those who can tell the story in such a way that I think, oh, but it is also achievable, and you've made it sound like it's easy because of who you as a leader are. Yes, I think you very much answered the question. And I'll turn the same question over to you, Shruti, for similar thoughts on sort of the same question. And I'd also love to hear, with sort of your investor hat on, how you would answer that question also through the lens of someone looking to invest capital.
Yeah, well, I would first just echo everything Abby said. Like, she's spot on with what makes a compelling pitch. I think the kind of the way that I might distill some of that is like this idea that explaining another idea to somebody to a 10-year-old. Like if you could distill a complex concept down to somebody who wouldn't otherwise have the background to understand it, how would you explain it to a kid? I think is a great way to get at the meat of what you're trying to do. I also think in terms of what makes something compelling, I think a lot about starting with why. Like, why are you doing this? Why do you care about it? And I think that's something that sometimes could get missed in the details that are being explained during a pitch, where we want to go right to the solution instead of really digging into actually, why is this a really compelling problem and why should we care? And it might be we should care because you care and you understand something about this problem that nobody else does. But that is your opportunity to explain it. And that's also your hook for getting an investor, potential investor interested in what you are doing. I think from an investor perspective, the pitches that are most compelling to me are the entrepreneurs that are able to identify with the problem. They have experienced the impact of the problem in a very specific way, and they can talk about why they're so passionate about having this specific problem be solved. And so I think that is something that I think a lot about, is like, what is your proximity to the problem? And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but also, why is this something compelling and why should we care?
I think that actually sets up a perfect transition into sort of a next piece of the conversation, which is this question of proximity. And the Climate Resiliency Challenge was so much about highlighting and uplifting community-driven solutions. And so I will direct this question to both of you, whomever feels like answering first. But if either of you can speak a little bit more to why it's important in any space, but I think really especially in climate resiliency, to understand the community, to understand the unique problem set in any community, and also share examples of why you've seen and when you've seen proximate leadership as being really key and important in being able to move a solution forward.
Abby, you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Sure. So in my experience building Think Circa, so it was an education technology company. Again, my co-founder was a teacher for 20 years. So she lived this. The very first meeting that we had, she brought her rubrics and lesson plans and graphic organizers and said, this is what kind of good teaching looks like. These are the lessons that I have 20 years of experience teaching and know should be kind of brought scalable to technology. So one, kind of have to inherently trust the people that have the lived experience, that they both know and understand the problem and components of the solution, right? Why I think we were a strong kind of duo is that I was able to pull out some of the, instead of just jumping directly to, and therefore here's what we should do, really listening to understanding kind of root cause, how systems work from that community through that lens was really critical. The other thing is then when you think about kind of building organizations, building founding teams, and kind of building solutions, is making sure that that lived experience is kind of worked throughout the DNA of the organization. So we ended up with about 50% of our staff was former educators across every department that we worked in, because, you know, including technology developers and school success and sales team, because the way that kind of that experience working with kids, working with other teachers, working with principals and district administrators across the entire system, we had to stitch that experience together to understand our stakeholders really well. So when we went in to pitch investors, or we went in to kind of talk about the story, we were able to, I think, walk in with some instant credibility that we have this really, really deep understanding of the problem, and we have years of experience that back up what that looked like. Now, I was not an educator, so I had to kind of give space to the folks in the room that had that lived experience as a leader. I also really had to do some work to kind of sit in. And for the first couple months of founding the company, I would go to schools and watch teachers and principals, see how they worked without the technology, so that I could, as a product person, as a technologist, map the moments of what's happening today without the technology, and then what could happen because of the technology. So that was then kind of gave me a superpower of relating to a non-educator audience of, listen, like, I don't have this lived experience, but let me tell you kind of through observation what I have learned and why we are the people to solve it. So giving voice to folks with the lived experience, and then also figuring out how you can integrate that into your solution, into your story, I think is a really critical component.
Ruti, how about you?
Yeah, I was gonna give you a little bit of a meta example, but I'm an investor in a company called Violet. And Violet started as a platform to be able to match people who, identify as LGBTQ with therapists who specialize in that patient population. And the founder of this organization founded it because this is a problem that he had. He wanted to find a therapist who he felt like could really understand his particular set of challenges. And there's obviously now a lot of medical research that shows that people who understand, or doctors, medical professionals, whether they're or physicians who understand specific patient populations, are able to deliver higher quality care. So what Violet has now evolved into is a platform that does the training and certification for physicians across hospital systems across the United States, to kind of certify them in treating specific patient populations, whether that might be Black patients or Asian patients or patients who identify as LGBTQ. And so the reason I bring up that example is that was a problem that he had very personally, and then realized that this is actually a larger problem and something that people are really looking for in the type of care that they receive. And the reason why it's a meta example is because it's obviously, a great example of why having somebody who can understand your specific needs as an individual is so valuable from a healthcare perspective. But I think from a company perspective, the way he thought about the problem was really focused on being proximate to a community that he was part of, and solving a problem for that community. I also, I think just more generally would flag that it's really useful to have people who understand problems in specific communities, because there are nuances to the way that the problem should get solved, given the political environment, who holds power. I think sometimes doing a power analysis, whether that's understanding, the structure of an institution or a city or an organization can be really useful in actually helping you figure out what the right solution is, because it's not always a simple, straightforward, well, we just build technology to solve this problem. There's often a lot of other factors that influence the adoption rate and your ability to implement. And so really understanding those pieces and the nuance that exists there is extremely important.
Great examples. Thank you both. I think that's been a great sort of frame for how to think about the storytellers and who, not only what is important in terms of the team leading an organization, but who you have talking about it. Something, Abby, that you and I talked about recently was sometimes it's not just about the conversation that you're in with others when you're talking about a concept or an idea. You might have isolated opportunities to pitch or to tell your story, but so often getting the word out there and getting people bought in and excited about your idea goes beyond sort of the pitch or the story, and really web presence can be an important piece. And I'm curious if either of you can talk about not just web presence, but sort of an online idea or an instance in which you had a really clear idea about what a team was doing, what they were building beyond kind of a conversation you'd had or a pitch you'd heard, whether that's a really great website you can point to that paints the vision, talks about the pain points, or even beyond that, a story or an example of when you've seen a great business concept go from ideation pitch into seed into a more evolved state now. Abby, I'll start with you.
Sure. So given that we're in the climate, so actually, let me start somewhere else. So I know a lot of the folks who applied to this, it was at varying stages, like might just be money to get a prototype. Do not think that you need to have like kind of fully formed and baked idea to start telling your story. At Think Circa, we started as like a paper-based prototype. That we just stood up a website saying, hey, this is the framework. Here are some example lesson plans you can download, just to get some traction, just to get some lists of trying to find and build a community of people that are interested in teaching, kind of this with this specific way. So it's never too early to start. You also like don't need to have something wildly polished. Like use Squarespace, use Wix, get something up there that just kind of says who you are and what you're kind of working towards. I think especially in the more early stages of companies, there's an incredible opportunity to really dig into the storytelling and the online presence of the problem and the solution. And not because you want to be a thought leader or you want to establish yourself for that, just as practice of what starts resonating online with people, with communities. How can you use some inbound of like people searching terms of things that you're also worried about or thinking about or in communities for? It gives people a place to just go where it's not a formal email, it's not a formal pitch, where people can just like learn about what you're up to and why. And so a couple examples that, I really like to highlight in the climate space, because I think they do a really, really good job of setting the context, not necessarily exactly for the solution or making an ask or, publishing a lot of material, but storytelling here's what we're doing and why, which is basically like the biggest 1-2 punch that I think you can have in a web presence is, Urban Ocean Lab does a really good job of like, here's what they do, here's why it's important, here's what the mission is, and here's how they do it. Like, it's very simple. It actually kind of almost reads like a pitch deck, but instantly, if I like can't search my email for what they do, I can instantly pop up to that site. Another really good example is flooddefenders.org. I think that this site, the second that I came across in my research, just like trying to understand, issues with flooding and flood insurance and some innovations in that space. When I stumbled across this site, I realized they, especially on the problem section, they do such a great job of storytelling into bite-sized chunks and images and dollars that demonstrate like why this is such a problem. The headlines and kind of everything about it. So if anything, I would say like use the internet and your presence as a way to drum up interest and drum up, we're in a space of climate resiliency and stuff that cannot wait. Use this as a place to drum up some urgency and passion from your community.
I think it's fun too to be talking about the importance of web presence while we at Network for Good are like in a big transition and don't currently have a great web presence. So people still go to our website and it's like not even really our organization. So acknowledging too that at different moments of time in your life cycle, you'll have different like materials available to you. And it's just about evolving that. I also think it's fun. I am often in conversations with Abby, and the experimentation mindset there is great, where Abby will give a pitch one day. And I'm like, oh, that's a really interesting way of talking about this. We're on a call, an hour and a half later, and it's a totally different frame. So I think too, like getting that skill and that muscle built up for changing the narrative, depending on who you're talking to, and experimenting and seeing what lands is also kind of a fun piece of this. Shruti, I'd love to turn it over to you for a similar, any examples you might have of this sort of presence and storytelling successes you've seen out there.
I just recently invested in a company that doesn't have a complete climate tilt, but it's a company called Gather Flora. And I think the way they describe what they do is really compelling. But basically, the company exists to help enable farmers to grow wildflowers in their off season and then sell those directly to event planners and florists. And they do this in all over California, and I think are hoping to be able to expand. But what's so compelling about it is that the founder understood, one of the challenges the farmers have, which is income streams in the non-traditional growing season. And also this movement towards buying more local flowers and demand from florists and from event planners who want access to more localized inventory. And so she's using software, she's an engineer, to think about how to streamline this process on both sides of the marketplace, and ultimately, to think more broadly about how this could both be an alternative income stream for these farmers, but also promote more sustainable practices across the board when it comes to buying and selling flowers. Just a quick note on the flower industry, the flower industry is a huge polluter, I guess you could say. There's a lot of flowers that get flown in from other parts of the world to places like the US. And so the carbon footprint is big, and this is a way to reduce that. So that's kind of one concrete example. But I think I just want to also echo Abby's thoughts on kind of iteration. When MoveLoot, the company I started, first launched, our website was so bad that we would repost all of our inventory back onto Craigslist to try to drive traffic to our site. And the first person that was ever interested in a sofa, emailed us and said, hey, I'm interested in this sofa. And we said, great, we're this new company. And we sent them the link to our website. And he said, I don't trust your website, but if you bring me the sofa, I'll give you $100 bill. And that's what we did. We got in a rented truck and we took the sofa to his house, and he gave us $100 bill. And from there, it was about iterating to the point where people trusted our technology and were willing to buy things on our website. But that is a great example of just getting something out in the world to explain what it is you're doing, and to also try to get in front of people who are going to give you important feedback about how to improve your product.
Great. Thank you for all of those examples. And we sort of have a sense of who's on the call today, but please chime in with any questions that we'll have an opportunity in a moment to start answering more of those. The hard thing about a webinar when it's just our faces and we can't see anybody else, it's helpful to know that certain things are resonating or not. So please chime in with questions if there's more you'd like to hear about, or other directions you'd like us to take the conversation. Another question that I have for both Shruti and Abby is curious what everything we've talked about today means specifically in the context of funding climate resilience. We've talked about sort of generally storytelling principles and ideas. I'm curious if there are thoughts either of you would add or offer specifically as it relates to storytelling about climate resiliency and the climate-driven disaster space. And I'd even extend that question to, this is an interesting, I think, moment and movement in that there are a lot of opportunities for sort of collectively capitalizing this space, that there's an importance of both telling any organization's individual and unique story, and also just advancing the conversation for example, all of the contributors who submitted ideas to the IDEO Climate Resiliency Challenge. So I'm curious, anything you might add about how storytelling ties back to this idea of capitalization for a broader ecosystem and how we think about getting these initiatives funded?
Trudy, you go first. I feel like I'm
just gonna
hogging
say.
all the answers.
So I think it's a really good question. I think when you think about the broader bucket of climate resiliency, it is a big problem that has that could potentially take a long time to solve. And I think there are lots of solutions that are going to chip away at the problem. So I think when I think about the story that you're telling, it's like, how is the solution that you are creating helping bite off a big piece of this problem? And why is the problem that you're going after so compelling? Like, why does this really move the needle? Because I think in this space, there are a lot of ideas, there's a lot of excitement, but I think really getting to the heart of what is going to move the needle in terms of actually helping us make progress towards mitigating disaster, improving the prospect of us not having to experience the impact of climate change to the extreme that we will potentially have to experience it. Like, I think those are stories and messages that are really compelling to people who are writing checks. And Abby, I don't know if there's anything you want to add there.
Yeah, the other really maybe like too tactically feedback that I'd give is do not limit yourself to one type of capital, and think about how to possibly shift your story based on how you are trying to grow your business. There is, I feel like, this really limited perspective on, oh, if you're a nonprofit that you want to either get donations from donors or apply for grants. Or if you're a for-profit, you really are only kind of going to venture. There are increasingly more opportunities for a blended structure of how you think about how you can use grant, non-dilutive capital to kind of get started. Competitions, yes. If you're in a position where you can get a loan, a bridge loan, things will get paid back. There are financing opportunities for prototypes, for kind of going to market and building physical products that capitalize different from building software. And finding people who have navigated those blended capital spaces to help you accomplish what you need to in the short, medium, and long term is really critical. Now, the storytelling components of what is your business model and what do you need to do it and what are the financials, and having some of the certainty that will help de-risk you taking on capital is critical, and is kind of part of maybe how you really need to tabletop your business model and thinking about where and how you will spend capital. But that's the job of an entrepreneur. So kind of a PSA, and one of the things that we're thinking about at Network for Good is how can we think about, capitalizing folks that are doing really important work towards how that might change, the outcome towards a more sustainable outcome. So you don't have to basically be dialing for dollars, that aren't for customers, that are just to get started. So think on that.
Yeah. I think that's a great, all thinking about the blended financing and blended different ways of thinking about capitalization. We've also talked a lot about sort of competitive philanthropy and the ideas of different organizations competing for dollars. And a trend that we've talked about some in our organization that we're seeing is just the sort of motivation for philanthropists, especially, but other investors too, to invest in or donate to organizations and solutions that are showing enthusiastic collaboration with other teams and organizations. So when you can show too, I think, where you fit within a problem or a challenge and the solution you're solving and the other folks you're collaborating with to advance the broader space, I think that's always, that's becoming, I think, an even more exciting thing for philanthropists, especially to see. There are a couple of questions that are popping into the chat. One came up that's about on a public forum that it can be uncomfortable to share cost-related information, especially if you have a working prototype. curious if either of you have thoughts on sharing confidential information without giving away, quote unquote, the secret sauce.
So quick feedback or kind of gut instinct is really like kind of storytelling through averages, storytelling through kind of basic, as if it costs you kind of $10 to build something, here's how much kind of hard costs, here's R&D. Like there is an element of just round numbers that directionally show unit economics of how and why something will scale. Hopefully that doesn't get to secret sauce regarding suppliers or specific things, but that's kind of part of the storytelling component. And like, think infographic style, round numbers, not specific, that help somebody just visualize what you're talking about. That might say, like, if we can get this, that's like, I think one of the parts of a pitch that investors always want to know. People don't care right out of the gates, especially if you're in the early days, like, oh, this is going to be the beautiful hockey stick growth. They want to know how much capital they can give, the least amount of capital they can give you to get to like the best next step that will give you the likely chance of success. So don't feel like you need to have like kind of this gorgeous model of, hey, we're spending this amount of money so we can go to these 4 or 5 places to get these outcomes. And again, round numbers, they don't have to be really, really specific. You have to feel confident in those. And it is a little bit of a storytelling around like this incremental investment here will save us, what is the metric of improvement, as well as by investing here, we're going to save this down the line. So I think in terms of like cost and outcomes, or cost to outputs to outcomes, can sometimes get a little convoluted, but something that I could go back and, again, to Shruti's point, like tell a 10-year-old, like lemonade stand math.
I think the other just quick thing that I would add on that is, I think sometimes, especially in the early stages of business, we become really worried about other people who could copy what we're doing. And I think really our focus should be on how do we build the best product that we can and scale it, I shouldn't say necessarily as quickly as possible, but to scale it in a way that, makes sense given the timing and the funding that you have. And I think, I'm just flagging that because I think, there's probably a limited universe of people who are going to look at your prototype and be like, I could copy that, or I could do that. And maybe it's naming for yourself who those people are, like who is the audience you're worried about seeing this, and then deciding from a risk perspective, like how risky is this actually? And sometimes, the answer is, oh, well, there's 3 other people in the world that could do this, and here are the reasons they might do it, and here are the reasons they might not do it. And it's actually worth the risk for us to put our story and what we're trying to do out in the world because of the broader potential impact that we could have.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets back to even to a little bit of like, sometimes there is opportunity even for collaboration with the folks who might borrow your idea or have similar ideas for how to do it. Sometimes it's scary and it is threatening to your organization. And obviously it differs based on a for-profit or a nonprofit model. But I think, again, that goes back to like, where are the opportunities for collaboration when ideas are perhaps similar or there are synergies? But it's sort of, to Shruti's point, who is the audience that you're perhaps worried about in this? And that actually kind of ties even into another question we got in here about not all audiences are going to be looking for the same thing in an idea. How do you think about shifting a story based on the audience you're talking to, either sort of generically, but also just even in terms of research? Where would you go to look up and understand your audience beyond reading their website? Any particular, investment criteria like we had for the IDEO Resiliency Challenge? How do you find out more about an audience and what would be appealing to them?
I could jump in real quick and just say that I think the audience question is a good one. I think it really comes down to prioritizing which audience is most important. So and also I say that, and audiences can shift in importance depending on the stage of your business or what you're trying to accomplish. But for a website where you're trying to explain what you do, or you want somebody to interact with what you're doing, your audience might be your customer. And I think one example I'll give you just about audiences is kind of actually like the Facebook challenge, which is that Facebook's audiences are multifold. So they have an audience that is people who have Facebook profiles who are interacting on Facebook. And then they have an audience that is their customer, the people paying their bills, that are advertisers. And so they have very distinct audiences, and they have very distinct ways of appealing to those audiences and building relationships with those audiences. And, you know, I guess you could argue in some sense that they would be nothing without all the people that have Facebook profiles, but they would really be nothing without all the people that are paying their bills. And so as you think about kind of the stage of your business and who is your audience priority, and, you know, at the early stage of a business, it might be early customers and investors. And how do you tell that story to prioritize that audience versus having, you know, a more broad-based approach? And then how does that shift and evolve over time, depending on kind of the different audiences that you're interacting with? But I think it's about getting really clear on who your audience is and who your most important audience is in this moment for your business.
And I would add that I think there's probably some greatest hits that all audiences care about, and then it's the level of depth you go. Credibility is a really good one. Working in education, I think establishing the credibility of who we are, what we were building, and why. You know, having my co-founder who had written a book from National Councils of Teachers of English was a big one. We had an advisory board that had, you know, kind of similar credentials. We invested in research from credible institutions. And then we had some early investors that kind of gave that social proof. So, you know, I think kind of try to bucket the audience of, okay, what type of rigor do you need to go to demonstrate something? If it's checking the box on credibility of, oh, these are former educators and they're building a product, great, versus, oh no, like they did a rigorous case study with control group research to demonstrate these claims they are making. How deep do they want to go? So think of it as a pyramid of, you know, kind of the top level, most generic, and then allow audiences to go down and down on the rigor. The other thing is, I think when you're pitching investors or foundations or anybody who might be giving you money, you have to connect it back to their thesis, their investment thesis, why they care about this too, right? So there's the why you care about this, but then how does this connect with their theory of change or kind of their areas of focus? And it's also really fantastic if you're able to kind of connect some dots in an ecosystem trend that you care that they believe in. Working in education, when I was the CEO of an ed tech nonprofit, I found that pitching some foundations that had already invested in open source technology or open source educational resources was a really good hook. Because I was like, oh, you believe that we need to democratize access, you know, equitable access. Great. Let me tell you how we do that. So it wasn't that we had to change the pitch or change our story or change our product. I just needed to kind of open with this, hey, this is a fundamental principle that we are aligned on that I can kind of build a springboard off of.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to that point, I mean, there's the question here of just how do you find out about your audience? And to that point, if you can learn what the investment criteria is for an investor, a foundation, sometimes just looking to the portfolio of who else a funder has supported, what other nonprofits are in the portfolio for this philanthropist or in the portfolio for this investor, you can start to see themes across those, even if their investment theory or strategy is not publicly, available or synthesized. You can tend to, I think, discern and kind of understand themes across the other things a funder is supporting. There's another question here that we've answered sort of, but more specifically asks, Abby, you talked about the process of iterating and changing and evolving. Is there any sort of quick advice you'd give on how to perhaps plan, prep, and improve on a pitch between rounds? And how, maybe this is a question for you, Shruti, do you see that being different in sort of the philanthropic context versus other investment audiences?
Our main story, our reason for being, our solution didn't change much. And one of the things that I wish I could return time back to myself was how much we focused on the features of what we were building I don't think that that's what got us money. I think the thing that got us money between rounds was a consistent update to our investors and supporters of how we were doing what we said we would do. Monthly newsletter of, hey, we said we were going to do this thing. Here's how it went. Here's how we learned. Here's what we're doing next. And so that consistent storytelling that wasn't a heavy lift is that when we then walked in for another round of funding, they knew kind of what happened in between. And not only that, we had built that credibility that like we said we were going to do something and then we did it, or oh, here's where we failed and learned, and here's what we're doing because of it. So we didn't have to catch them up on history. So that, and then that also, I think, was one of the things that got us introductions to new investors, new fresh capital. So I don't think it's necessarily like the discipline of changing or transforming your story or responding to the market. Yes, it's here's what we've learned and here's how we're doing and here's why we need more money. But it's really like the thing that I really, really appreciated was the diligence of keeping people along the journey with us that helped them see what we were seeing and feel like then in between rounds when we were ready to do more or go for another big swing, they were like, okay, they've demonstrated that they can handle this.
I totally agree with all of that. I think it goes a really long way with investors if they don't feel like they're out of the loop, and then they can just jump in and say, actually, I'm really excited to keep supporting you in this way. I think the other thing about fundraising that I've talked to founders a lot about is running a process and having a forcing function. So particularly in the early stages, identifying, doing your research on who are the people that you want sitting around your table and why do you want them around your table? It might be because they have compelling experience that's really going to help you move the needle. It might be that they've invested in companies that are similar before, so they really understand the space. But thinking about what is the value that they might be able to add beyond capital, and using that as part of your pitch to them. People like to be asked for their advice as much as their money. And I think that is a really valuable thing to be able to do in terms of just getting people in quickly. The other thing I mentioned was a forcing function. At MoveLoot, we were out of space. We had physical warehouse space. We were out of warehouse space. We'd taken over 8 storage units. And there was a warehouse that we'd identified that we wanted to close on. And the landlord said, well, you can't do this unless you have more capital in your bank account, generating revenue. We had money coming and didn't trust that we'd be able to do that. Oh, I hope I didn't.
You cut out a little bit, but I think you said was we can't let you have the unit unless you have more capital.
Am I still here?
Okay. You're coming in and out. Okay, I think we lost Shruti. Shruti, if you come back, just chime in, because I do want to hear the end of that thought. Are you back?
Yes.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, can you hear me now? I'm back.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So the end of that is basically that we used that as the forcing function with our investors. So we said very specifically to our investors, or to people that were interested in investing, we need this space to be able to grow our business, and we're constrained. And that actually really helped people get over the line in terms of wanting to invest in the business. So I think that's also something that is valuable. And then the last thing I'll say about philanthropy is that in my experience, philanthropy moves a lot slower. So if you are interested in taking philanthropic dollars, you want to be able to build that into your timelines, just because the time for them to review an application or an opportunity and then to actually get a disbursement of funding, in some cases can take half a year. So it's just important to know that.
Well, and that piece about different financing models and sources exist on different timelines. They operate really differently. Someone asked the question in here, where can we learn more about this blended financing structure of funding that Abby mentioned and that now you've both talked about a little bit? That might require its own hour, I think, to meaningfully talk about. But and we only have a couple of minutes left. There are another few questions that came in that I think are a little more specific to particular organizations and your pitches and sort of particular challenges. We'd be happy to continue the conversation. So feel free to reach out if there are specific questions that might be helpful for us to answer. I already have calls scheduled next week with a few folks from different project teams. But in terms of that last question, I think we'll end there of just where might you learn more about blended financing structures and opportunities. I think maybe the best use of a couple of minutes left on the call is if either of you have thoughts to share on that, that would be great. But also if there are particular resources you might point folks toward for looking into education around that, that might be just useful resources to throw out there too. Oh, Abby, you're muted.
Yep. I can't believe that, like, in the last 2 minutes, I made it the whole time, and for the last 2 minutes, talk on mute. So off the top, a couple resources to look at. So Nonprofit Finance Fund, kind of great place that helps think about blended capital. Propel Advisors, I think. Maddie, you can drop that in the chat. They offer consultancy services on thinking about blended finance. There's a couple like capital partners, like Capital Impact Partners, Third Sector. There's an organization called Impact Assets. It's basically like the reverse market where they are talking to foundations and impact investors about how to invest their money. But they put together what's called an Impact Assets Top 50 list. Take a look at that because it actually shows a bunch of different firms that likely are doing impact investing with different areas of focus. And it's, for any budding entrepreneur, try to get a meeting, see what your pitch is, like understand how they think about you and your organization. It will be the best learning is just doing the pitch and asking people for money or asking people for advice because they likely know and are dialed into other people that are funding things. And then, do not cut out government funding as a potential source. It's very long and arduous, and I know and recognize that, but look at the SBA, look at some specific government programs and funding that is going towards an area of focus. One of the things we did at Think Circa is that we found folks on, kind of Upwork and even thinking about OpenAI on how you might respond to some RFPs quickly, easily, et cetera, because that could be a really, really important funding source and a way to build partnerships with researchers that demonstrate why your solution can take off.
A couple quick ones that I would add, Lighter Capital, which is really for software businesses, but that's revenue-based financing. There's a lot of actually emerging funds in this space that are really interesting to look at. So if you do have software or you're building software and you have recurring revenue, that can sometimes be a good place to look. There are some of these alternative just asset classes that exist more in the tech VC world. I think Indie VC is one that comes to mind. They shut down for a little while, but are coming back. So probably good to put that on your radar. And then, I think somebody mentioned this in the chat, but accelerator programs can always be a helpful resource, just in terms of at least getting you some seed capital to get something out into the world and then connecting you not just with investors, but honestly a network of entrepreneurs who are in the trenches with you. And actually that's really an invaluable network to have in the long run.
Great. Well, we are at time. Thank you, everybody, for your time. Dennis, I'll turn it over to you, but we'll also capture those resources and I'm sure you can help us get them shared out with everyone. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll also just say thank you to everybody, Maddie, Abby, and Shruti. It was great to have you. It was an amazing conversation, and I feel like I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody also really appreciated hearing from you. Maddie, I'll coordinate with you. We will send out a list of the resources you listed. I also have been on the search for climate fellowships and accelerators that apply to climate resilience, our topic of focus. So we'll send out that list just so everybody has access. But I hope this was as beneficial to everybody as it was to me, thinking about how do we tell strong stories, how do we get our ideas out in the world, and how do we get more money? That's a big part of being able to move forward. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.